I'll introduce myself. My name is Steve Garcia. I'm the unit forester for CAL FIRE's Nevada Eagle Placer unit here in Auburn. And Dave and Brandy asked me to put together a presentation to talk about some of the basics of wildland fire behavior. So we've decided we're going to try and do a three-part series. This part of the series is the beginning. And I tried to explain to Dave and the staff here today that really the way I see it is like the waves on Lake Tahoe. I'm just going to be kind of skipping off the high part of the waves and hitting on a couple of concepts that of a much deeper and broader subject. And then at the next meeting, we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of the concepts. Today, I'm going to talk about fuels, weather, and topography. We're going to dive into some information about wildland fuels. And then at the next presentation, I'm going to go much deeper into the fuels dynamic. The final session will be centered around kind of the home hardening, the concept about ember intrusion and how, if we take some of the concepts from the beginning and consider fuels reduction and decreasing the amount of embers that are produced, how home hardening really becomes the suite of treatments really becomes the solution to like structure loss or major loss of structures, even in a fairly aggressive wildland fire. And so I have the group in the back that's going to be pushing slides. My goal is to get through this in 30 minutes, but they've given me a few extra in case it runs long. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. So we'll go ahead and move to the first. I promise you the first two slides are heavy to text. I'm going to try not to just read them off, but there are some basic concepts here. And under the most weather conditions, wildfire is very predictable. If you just put fire on the landscape, it's going to do certain things based on the fuels, weather, and topography. However, we start to see in extreme fire behavior that things become a little bit less predictable, but the general influences that cause a fire to move still impact the fire. And so it's
I've
still
got it as loud as possible on here too.
still somewhat predictable, even in an extreme event. So once an ignition occurs, fire behavior is a function of three environmental factors, and those are the fuels, the wildland fuels on the landscape, the weather conditions, and the topography. You really have to have a grasp of all these factors to understand fire risk. However, really when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about one of those, and that's fuel. Fuels are the key element that we can manipulate, and vegetative fuels form the basis for really the philosophy around doing fuels reduction, defensible space, and home hardening. If we didn't have the fuels, we wouldn't have the fire problem. However, as we'll see, hopefully in some videos towards the end, a very limited amount of fuels can still generate significant fire behavior. It's just a matter of whether the carburetor is tuned just right, and those minimal amount of fuels become, very extreme. Next slide. So I found this, and it really goes into a couple of different concepts. When it doesn't matter what is burning, but when a fire is burning, it really requires that you have heat, a heat source, fuel, and oxygen. Okay? If you remove the oxygen, then the fire can't burn. If you remove the heat, the fire can't burn. And if you remove the fuel, the fire can't burn. So it's a three-legged stool that impacting any one of those elements can reduce the fire's ability to burn. That's really what we're doing when we're putting water on a fire, or we're using foam to choke out a fire, or we're using dirt to squash a fire, or we cut the vegetation away from the fire line and remove it. Is we're trying to offset that balance. That is the fire triangle. What we're talking about today is the fire behavior triangle, which is the next triangle out on this image, which is the orange line. that fire behavior triangle really relies on the fuel, weather, and topography. There's also a fire regime triangle, which is the broader over a series of decades, for example, what is the fire regime in the landscape? And that is much more related to the climate, the source of ignitions, and what types of vegetation that you have on the landscape. So we're just going to focus on that center fire behavior triangle. Next slide. So just remember that fire risk is not the same thing as fire hazard. Okay. It's very important to remember that because people confuse that scenario. Fire hazard, like when we talk about the fire hazard severity zones, assumes the worst case scenario with absolutely no modification of fuels and no assets at risk. Okay. It's essentially assuming a non-human intervention situation. If you had just natural processes, how much vegetation are you going to have? What are the weather conditions and what's the fuel like? What would the fire do in the worst case scenario? That's the reason why you see the maps the way they are, even though somebody may have done fuels reduction. It's because the fuels reduction is not part of the equation. It's as though there was no human there for 50 years and the natural vegetation was able to regain the site. Fire risk is much more related to the impact that that fire has as it's entering into structures or a community or other assets at risk. Okay. That's kind of a sidebar, but I wanted to make sure that that was clear because it is something that comes up regularly. Okay. So I have a question. Are weather and climate closely related? What do we think here?
Sure.
Can you use those terms universally?
Sure.
You could, because your climate over a single day is actually the weather. In other words, weather is a term that's looking at the conditions for today, a short duration, whereas climate is a much longer time frame. Think about a multi-year drought and the fuel conditions after a multi-year drought versus any given August day. Okay. Yes, it's very dry in August, but is that August day following 3 years of very high precip and other environmental conditions, the atmosphere being heavily laden with moisture? Well, you may have more thunderstorms and other events that cause more moisture in the atmosphere for that August compared to another August after 3 years of drought. That's what we experienced when we had the major drought cycle, back like 4 years ago, and increased numbers of fires. And those drought cycles that I see, really being a marker for large damaging wildfires. It's just, they correlate. Okay. One of the, I think, understandable ways that you can kind of grasp this is in the forested landscape. If you have a large log that's laying out there drying out for 3 years, it's going to be much more readily flammable than a log that's laying under snow every winter and doesn't have a chance to dry out because it's moist and it's cold for 6 months out of the year. That's the kind of impact that causes a fire that may just burn through a forested stand from being a ground fire to being something that crowns out and runs up a canyon. So are weather and topography closely related? What do we think?
Mhm.
Yeah, I would say yes, because when it comes to topography, and we'll talk about aspect here in a second, whether you're on a south-facing slope or a north-facing slope is going to impact the fuel moistures, the temperature regime. It actually changes the entire environmental dynamic. And you can have situations where the weather may not be extreme, but a fire can make a major run just in fuels because the ground's very steep. And so topography is like one of the We don't change it very easily, but it has major implications when it comes to fire behavior. Okay. The other aspect is that topography can drive the ability of the soil to produce biomass. You have very deep soils that are very, they hold a lot of moisture and they're very full of nutrients. Then it will grow a lot of vegetation. Well, if you have a lot of vegetation, you have a lot of fuel. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So what I wanted to do here with this, this is an example of our fire history map. And I wanted to show you how there is predictability in these large extreme fire events. And what we're looking at here, the different colors represent different decades of fires. And the colored blobs on the landscape are fire perimeters. And so this is spanning from 1970 to 2022. And you can see, I'm going to step off the camera here for a minute, but you can see this. Does everybody see the dot? You see this arrow is indicating the major spread direction of the fire. Okay, this is the King Fire. What this line represents is when the King Fire burned through Stumpy Meadows Reservoir and dropped down into the Rubicon drainage. It made a major fire run of about 17 miles in a 12-hour period. And so that fire was moving all the way up to Hellhole Reservoir in very rapid fashion, and it was extreme. I will tell you, because I was there watching that, and it was pretty wild. Same situation just to the north. This is the Star Fire. And that orientation, that arrow direction is showing you which way that fire spread. I'll come up here. This is the American Fire from 2014. Okay. This arrow right here is the Ralston Fire, which I think was in 2006. And then this is interesting because there are two arrows here. This is actually the Mosquito Fire. The Mosquito Fire really started at the intersection of two drainages, and it more or less did what it wanted to do up both drainages. Okay, so let me move up here to the Interstate 80 corridor. The 2001 Gap Fire. This is the Lowell Fire from 2015, I believe. This is the River Fire outside of Colfax. Okay, are we seeing a pattern here? Here's the Ponderosa Fire. This is the Stevens Fire 2014, the Roberts Fire, I'm sorry, that was 2004. This is the Roberts Fire 2012. Okay, well, look at this one. That's interesting. The arrow's pointing the opposite direction. That's the 49er Fire, which started on a north wind event and burned from up by Highway 49 and Birchville Road and then ran down Canyon. Okay, and then you have these interesting stripes down here in the valley. Those are wind-driven fires down in the grasslands. And so you can see the shape of the fires is different, the orientation of the fires. These fires up here in the mountainous terrain are when the fire ignition aligns with topography and wind. Our wind pattern during what we would consider a fire day is generally out of the southwest towards the northeast. Our canyons in many of these scenarios orient from the southwest to the northeast. And so they're oriented with an upward slope in alignment with the wind. So when you get an ignition there, that's a recipe for very rapid ignition, and those fires will run. They come up to the ridge line, they're spotting ahead of themselves, and the fires push and broaden out as they go up the drainage. They may catch a secondary drainage and run off. And so they're spreading and widening out. These wind-driven fires are kind of like more pinpoint lasers, and they're being lofted forward by their ember production, but they're not really widening out. There's really no side movement to them, besides the fact that we have the most rock star firefighters that are chasing these fires down and trying to keep them from spreading out. Whereas when we get into these scenarios where you have a large fire up in the canyon, not right away, but pretty soon you're thinking about, okay, where are we going to catch it? Which ridge are we going to catch it on? And your plan moves out, your big box starts to move out and ahead of the fire. Okay, so would you say that if you know the weather conditions and you know the topography, is it somewhat predictable what a fire might do? Pretty good concept. It's demonstrated here. Not always. Weird things happen. The mosquito fire happened to occur at a time when a large cumulonimbus cloud collapsed, and a fire that you would expect to go upslope moved with the wind downslope, and it went down across that Middle Fork American and got onto the slope below Michigan Bluff. So the weather factors do drive it. You can't just rely on one element like topography. There are fires on this map that were purely driven by fuel, but they don't make the mark because as soon as the fuel runs out, then the dynamics change and those fires can be a little bit more easily contained. So really, when we're talking about an extreme fire that's rapidly moving, that's the combination of things that happens, okay? Next slide. So here's an example of our topography. I'm standing on above Iowa Hill Road looking down canyon, and you can see that there are some stripes in the landscape here. Those are runs of the fire, the Ponderosa fire that ran out of the American River drainage and then ran up to the ridge line, okay? So you can see how just the sheer slope makes containment of that fire very challenging, but it also impacts the ability of that fire to spread. The fire is able to use the heat energy transfer, which we'll talk about in a second, to more rapidly move up onto the hillside. It's an alignment of the embers, the radiant heat, the convective heat, the conductive heat. It's all projecting ahead of itself, and so those fires can make quick runs up onto a ridge line. When that fire gets to the top of a ridge, it reverses, and now it has to actually back down the hillside on the backside. Okay. Another note for those canyon fires is when you have a fire that's established on both sides of the drainage, that's a much bigger sort of problem than if it's on one side. There is some very interesting physics that go on with all the weather and the heat that will cause that fire to spread a little bit more rapidly than if it's just on one side. Okay, let's move forward. So one of the aspects of topography is the aspect. Okay, which direction is the hill slope facing? And you can see that in what we're seeing here is this is representing the morning time sun, the midday sun, and then the afternoon sun. Okay. And then for each one of those conditions, the slopes are identified by these colored bars. Okay. So in the peak heating of the day, when the sun is its most aggressive, the south facing slopes are extremely hot, which correlates to extremely dry and then much more flammable. And so the fire behavior impact on a south facing slope at midday is elevated. Whereas on an eastern facing slope or a northern facing slope, you have the opposite effect because the slope is on the shaded side. Okay. And so when you come from the east side to the west side, as the sun's moving across the sky and it's moving around to the setting, now the west facing slopes become the critical element. So just the shape of the land, the angle of that slope, if the sun's at a 45-degree angle to the earth and you're on a 45-degree slope, you're getting direct sunlight on it. Whereas if it's flat, the sun's coming in at an angle. Okay. All of that compounds and impacts the fuels. The fuels themselves are going to be drying quicker. The nature of the vegetation itself is different because if it's on a south facing slope and it can survive, it probably has a lot of waxes in it, which are flammable. all of those compounds in the vegetation that are designed to keep the plant alive in extreme heat also happen to be extremely flammable. Okay. And so instead of having large timber, you have chaparral or other species of plants that are more flammable. So the aspect is just one very dynamic topographic feature that we look at when we're trying to evaluate fire behavior. Again, I'm skimming across the surface. I'm not even talking about slope, like extremely steep slopes, flat slopes, totally changes the ability of a fire to spread, okay? Elevation, okay? We're gonna talk about those things a little bit more in future presentations, but I'm just touching on these concepts. So let's move on to the next slide. So we went through topography, and now I'm gonna go through some climate and weather factors. You know, we can all understand that the sun is impacting the surface of the earth in different ways, depending on where you are. Northern latitudes, at some time of the year, they get sun all year round, or all day and night. And then in some periods of the winter, they get no sun at all, just as the axis of the earth causes that earth to tilt away from the sun or towards the sun is impacting the surface of the earth in different ways. That's the differential heating is a pretty critical element when you talk about climate. So the latitude, the elevation and topography, if there are lots of water bodies and this impact of the greenhouse effect, those are major climate factors, okay? The coastal belt, can it burn? Do we have fires on the coast? Is it less likely to occur? I would say yes, because the sponge, that big Pacific Ocean, is emanating a lot of moisture, and it's also moderating the temperatures. And so that coastal belt tends to not have as extreme weather conditions that we might have up here in the foothills or in the Sierra Nevada. But see, so that's climatological impact that has broader implications on the vegetation types, the flammability of that vegetation, how much vegetation can grow. But I can tell you, because I've been there, when the coast does burn and it wants to burn, you better get out of the way, because it's got 100 years of vegetation growth that's built up there, and it will go off, just like it will up here in the mountains. It's just that the likelihood of occurrence is different because of those influences. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So this is a little bit wonky, but I wanted to just present this concept that the reason why we have a problem with vegetation fires and why fuels are a factor is because really the vegetation, as I point out on the bottom here, wood is solid sunshine, and it's saturated in water. The sun, the energy from the sun, when combined with 6 water molecules, 2 carbon dioxide molecules, the sun and chlorophyll, creates a reaction. That's photosynthesis, right? The sun is like putting energy into the plants, and it creates carbohydrates. The carbohydrates link together. That's glucose, and it creates cellulose and lignin. So the sun is, in combination with chlorophyll, hydrogen dioxide or CO2 and H2O, is creating these links of sugars that is wood. So the sun is solid, or the wood is solid sunshine. It's just stored. So that heat energy transfer that's happening is storing that heat energy. The sun is storing itself in wood fiber. Okay, well, how did that energy get here? Through sunlight, There's light and heat energy that comes off the surface of the sun and it translates to the earth. And then those plants absorb it and they store it. That's how trees get bigger. They grow, they get tall. If you cut that down and you cut it into cordwood and put it in your wood stove, it generates a lot of heat for you, right? It'll burn for a long time. Well, that's what's sitting out there is a bunch of solid sunshine, okay? So it's really just stored energy.
Something new.
Next slide. Try one more. Okay. So cue for you guys is when I tell you to go forward, you actually have to click on that picture. Okay. So this is an image of fire. So now click on the image. This is an image of fire. This image is the surface of the sun. It's an image through a telescope of the surface of the sun. This is an image of a wildland fire. What's the difference? Distance. One's on the sun and one's on the earth. But the physics.
Sunshine going back.
It's sunshine that's being released back as heat energy. Okay? It's just, you can't stop it. But you can manage that fuel to reduce the heat that's put off. Imagine if we were to take that heat energy and put it through a biomass plant and make electricity and use that electricity to heat our homes or light our homes. What a concept. The sun's giving it to us, right? You don't even have to put it through a solar panel. Just burn it off, right? Anyway, I digress. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about fuels, just as a rough concept. The series of photos you're going to see here are really trying to show how ground fuels, ladder fuels, and canopy fuels all link up to, how am I doing for time? Okay, all of those fuels link up to potentially extreme fire behavior. And by breaking that chain, you can change the dynamics in that forest stand and have less potential fire behavior, okay? So you can see there's ground fuel here, which is the leaves. The leaves, the needles, the broken dead material, okay? And then you have ladder fuels, which is the material that's elevated up off the ground. And in this picture, we don't really have any canopy fuels, but you know, in the right conditions, a fire that occurs in this light flashy material will translate into the next layer. And if there were a layer above that, it could translate into the layer above. That's why we ask people to, you know, eliminate ladder fuels when we ask them to do their defensible space work, okay? Next slide. There's another example. This is a manzanita stand at about 2,500 foot elevation. You have mountain misery, pine needles. There's pine needle drape in the manzanita with a high component of dead material. This manzanita is very young, but it still has dead material in it. Because of the needle drape, I know that there's a canopy of pines above that. And so there are crown fuels there. So in the right conditions, say you have a drought and all those pines are susceptible, maybe they've been impacted by bark beetles and now they're highly flammable. That fire will translate off the ground into this dead material and it will allow the fire to go up into that canopy, okay? Are we getting the major concept here? Next slide. Because really what we're talking about is fire spread. That's what's going to come next. How's the fire going across the landscape? Here's another example. This is a forested stand, just a forest stand that's been unmanaged. You can see small trees in here that are dead, all the leaf litter, okay? You've got ground fuels, ladder fuels, crown fuels. They're all there. Next slide. Another example. We happen to have some very nutrient rich, very good soils here, and they will grow an immense amount of vegetation. If we don't treat that, if we don't manage that lower canopy, it's actually eventually will impact the growth of the upper canopy. The whole forest becomes more at risk because of the lack of management in the lower stand. In addition to that, if you eliminate that lower stand, the forest actually responds to that release and will become more healthy and more vibrant up in the canopy. Okay, it's really just like gardening in the forest. Concentrate the growth on the healthy trees, keep them healthy. They shade the ground, and so you end up with potentially less extreme fire. Next slide. Here's another example. I'm not going to belabor that fact anymore. Next slide. So this is really just taking those two concepts that we just talked about, which are the topography and fuels, and really what we're looking at here is just really rough conditions for fire. I mean, when you have steep slopes and heavy dense fuels, when those conditions are right, you can have a pretty extreme fire. This is towards the heel of the Robbers Fire. That bridge that you see there is the Yankee Jim's, the old Yankee Jim's bridge. And that you can see the fire here after it ran up onto the top of the hill at Kings Hill above the Shirttail Canyon. Okay, next slide. Let's pass this. This is too much. Okay, so I wanted to give an example of like heat energy. And so this is a standard propane tank, about 200 gallons of propane when full to 80%. Very common in our area. Raise your hand if you have one of these, okay? How many BTUs are gonna come out of that? A lot. Next slide. So this information is all condensed from some research that's done by the UC Sierra Foothills Research and Extension Center. We call it the field station out in Brownsville. But essentially, they're collecting grass clippings and trying to gauge how much growth did they have. I use that information to convey to the firefighters, this is how much heat energy you're going to encounter in this year's grass crop. Okay, and it is extreme. Because this 200-gallon propane tank, think about how many tri-tips you can cook with that. Like how many cows can you cook with that 200 gallons of propane? There's 18,300,000 BTUs coming out of that tank. And for the year 2017 to 2018, there was about 42 million, almost 43 million BTUs per acre generated from the grass growth. Okay. There was a high in 92 and 93 of 36,558,000 roughly. Okay. So for every square foot, you're talking about, I don't know, at the low range, 200 BTUs, at the higher end of the scale, almost 1,000 BTUs. BTU is, I wanted to do a slide on that, but there's just not enough time. It's the amount of heat energy required to heat a pound of water 1 degree. So turn your propane stove on, put a pound of water in a pot, and measure the heat energy it takes to raise that pot by 1 degree, okay? This is an extraordinary amount of heat energy coming off of grass.
What's the size of the grass you're measuring? For
This is a random sample of 1 foot squares that is correlated out to the per acre amount. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so this is just giving you the concept of how fuels reduction results in less BTUs. If you graze it, if you mow it, if you remove it, the BTUs are gone. If you got 1 set of BTUs coming off of this grass versus the other side, okay? We can grasp that concept, right? Next slide. How am I doing for time? Okay. Same image. This is grazing that we did with Placer County Water Agency at Lake Theodore, right there at Clipper Gap. Next slide. And this is a picture on Highway 49, right up by where the 49er fire started on Birchville Road. And those folks there, they cut their grass and they put it into hay and they feed the hay to their animals. It's energy, remember? It's the sun's energy bound up in the fibers that gets bundled up and goes into a cow to make protein. Well, that's a pretty good, pretty well treated landscape right there, isn't it? Once those bales are gone, even if it burned through the bales, that's a different fire dynamic than if that grass is up to your eyeballs. Okay. Next slide. That's our desired future condition. Obviously that looks like a park. Next slide. Same thing, heavy herbaceous canopy under timber. Next slide. And this is a post-fire example. This is actually on my property. There's a dude right there with a drip torch. And so you can see just reducing that BTU content is really the recipe for reducing fire behavior. Next slide. Another pretty picture. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so there are three modes for heat transfer that causes fire spread. One is conduction, one's convection, and one's radiation. Conduction is heat transferred through direct contact. So the fire is burning from pine needle to pine needle to pine needle. It's conducting heat energy by touch. Convection is that heat that's going aloft. It may not be the flames, it could just be the heat, but that heat is then preheating and drying out the fuel. But it's still heat energy that's transferring. And then radiation is the invisible heat energy, like the stuff that's coming from the sun across through space and impacting the earth. That's another type of heat energy, but all of those are causing the fire to move forward, okay? That's how fire spreads, is through conduction, convection, and radiation. A combination of those that I've kind of had a hard time in this presentation grasping is that the idea of embers are actually more than one. It's conduction because the ember itself burning touches something and then translates the heat and catches that thing on fire. But it's also convection because the embers are going aloft and being translated downstream somewhere, downwind, okay? Next slide. So again, on fire spread, the concept of fuel-driven versus slope-driven, that flat plane example is really showing you that a fire has to move through the fuels and hopscotch forward in order for it to spread. There's no impact of wind. The embers are going straight up, right? You're on a flat plane. There's no motivation for it to move with slope, okay? Whereas the steep slope example is showing you something very different. Just the fact that that fire is on a slope now puts unburned fuels ahead of the fire. So you have the conduction, the convection, and the radiation all working together. The flat plane is really just relying on the radiation and the conduction. It's preheating by radiation, and then the fire translates through the fuel. Okay? Next slide. Now this is getting into a few terms that we use as wildland firefighters, but I liked this slide because it's showing how wind and fire spread, it causes that fire to potentially spot, like here's a spot. It can run up in fingers. You have a head versus the heel of a fire, right? And you can just envision as that fire is rolling across different topography with different wind conditions and different aspects, different times of the day. That fire is like a living, breathing thing that changes how it responds to those conditions as it moves across the landscape. Okay? So, because Dave asked me, like, well, how does fire spread? How does it move? Well, that's how it's moving, is it's consuming that fuel in the least restrictive pathway. Next slide. Now, once a fire is transitioned from, say, like a low burning, very low intensity fire, and it has the ability to get into a tree, we see what's called passive crown fire or torching. Single individual trees, fire translates up into the branches, and then that thing torches out. Okay. But then after it torches out, it kind of subsides for a minute. And then maybe it takes 20 minutes and it gets into another cluster of needle draped manzanita. That needle cast catches fire. The dead material in the manzanita catches fire. It pushes up into the canopy. It catches hold of those dead pine needles, and then poof, it torches off. And then the fire drops back down. That's torching. Okay. It's telling you that something could happen. That something is when the canopies are all connected. The conditions are right for this crown fire to initiate, and it becomes a dependent or active crown fire. When it talks about dependent, what that means is that there's a heat energy source underneath that canopy that's keeping the crown fire up in the canopy, not allowing it to drop back down. When we do fuels reduction, our goal is torching's fine, but I want that fire back down on the ground. If the torching never happens, that's okay too. I want the fire on the ground. I want it to be slow. I want it to be low. I want to give time for the resources to put the fire out. I want people to be able to evacuate. Okay, fire resources in, people out. Torching, you can manage torching, but the crown fire, that becomes a little bit much more complicated of an animal. And when we do fuels reduction correctly, even with a dense canopy, that fire can burn through that crown, hit that change in fuel, and then just drop out. That's really what we're shooting for when we do like large ridgeline fuel breaks or landscape treatments, where a fire runs up the canyon and then it gets up onto the flats and it just kind of settles down onto the ground. And then our dudes go and do their thing, put it out. This independent situation, that is extremely rare, but that's more related to long periods of extreme drought, extreme burning conditions. All the fuels are available, and it doesn't require that fuel on the ground. It's not dependent on the fuels underneath to sustain that crown fire, and it will carry through that crown, and it can run right over the top of water. It'll just lay over the top of water. Fuels burn out, fire goes out, that's great. But you see this in some very extreme situations. I don't have videos of that right now today, but I have some other videos hopefully we'll get to. How are we doing for time? 4 minutes left? Okay, move forward. We talked about fire spread with spotting. This is just showing you how a fire puts embers up into the airspace, and there are factors which impact the ability of that ember to go out and spot ahead of the fire. Okay, spotting is one of the major concerns I have when it comes to the fire interface to the community, because the embers themselves are they're gonna drop out, they're gonna fall into some crevice, and they just kind of sit there. And the next thing you know, the lawn furniture is on fire, and then the house is on fire, and nobody realizes it because it's a mile out in front of the fire. I don't have time for stories, but one day I'll tell you about a spot fire 6 miles ahead of the King Fire. Okay, it happened, and it does happen. Next slide.
This one is a terrifying experience. Unfortunately, scenes like this are going to be more common as climate change increases wildfire activity. Average annual temperatures across the western U.S. have risen nearly 2 degrees in the past few decades, allowing large wildfires to thrive on these dry, extreme conditions. You can just feel
Believe
the
that,
heat.
that's fine.
Temperatures over 1,500 degrees, flames shooting high into the air. Guess what? We can get fire whirls that develop in an instant. Pockets of extreme temperature causing the air to accelerate upward, right? Air rushing in toward the ground to fill the void. Rotation
Look at the
tightens
embers
and
flying
produces a
across
column
the
of swirling
landscape.
fire and smoke. These fire whirls, as they're called, are often short-lived and usually less than 50 feet across. But under certain conditions, large fires, like this one, can generate pyrocumulus thunderstorms that can produce large, long-lasting firenadoes. They can be hundreds of feet across and thousands of feet tall. Look at the size of that thing. Could you imagine the power? They combine the intensity of the raging fire with the destructive power of a tornado. Winds over 140 miles an hour leave a trail of destruction and create extremely hazardous conditions for firefighters.
Go ahead and kill that one.
Unfortunately, this terrifying display might be showing up more often as warming temperatures and
Okay, so really the purpose for this is to show you like those fires that get established in one of those canyons down at the base of a drainage, and it really gets initiated and it's running through the crowns. That's really what we're talking about right here, is that fire is all burning as one unit. And it's just whirling around itself and it's carrying itself forward. It puts up so much heat energy and so much moisture that it creates a big white cumulus cloud up in 30,000 foot elevation. And sometimes those collapse, just like a regular thunderstorm will. And it can cause further impact to the fire out ahead. But it's just a display of the amount of heat energy coming off. And so once you have that condition, you know, that's not something that you can just make a stand in front of. Okay. So the goal would be to prevent that from happening in the first place. Let's go on to the next video. Relatively light fuels compared to what we have in our fire environment, but very extreme fire behavior. Okay. And the very first part of this, the first 20 or 30 seconds, you're going to see some big bunches of vegetation that break off of a tree and go aloft and start flying through the air. Okay. Imagine trying to control that spread with those on fire. That's exactly what we ran into on the mosquito fire. When the thing burned up to the top of the ridge, we're working on a power line corridor. I have dozers working all over the place. And all of a sudden, this fire devil kicks up, and I see a manzanita bush about 3 feet in diameter on fire, and it just flies through the air, goes about 200 yards out past where we're cutting line, and falls on the ground. I'm like, go get it. And we go get that one, and then another one goes up and it's like, okay, change of plan. This is obviously not working. But the amount of energy necessary to make that happen is in the atmosphere. And once that fire initiates, it accelerates that ability of that fire to cause that rotation. And that's the challenge in controlling these kinds of fires. This is what we consider to be extreme fire behavior. Go ahead and hit play. And we're going to hold the audio because you're really just hearing equipment running and the roar of the fire. You can see the rotation just beginning. There's the large plants that are flying through the air. That is an extreme amount of energy that allows that to happen. Okay, you got fire from the ground all the way to the tippy tops of the trees. Look at that rotation. Okay, we have these tools where we show like what happens when fire is perfectly in tune. It's basically a glass cylinder that you put a little fuel into, and it has some ability to pull air in. And once you light that fire and put the glass tube on it, it is literally just it's just a rocket. And when everything comes into tune, it's like a rocket that you can hear the torch going off. And then I think you guys are going to just move forward through various clips. So you're looking at vegetation that it does have trees that might be up to 50 feet tall that are scattered around. There's a lot of chaparral. Okay. This is another example of a fire whirl. Again, where the carburetor is perfectly tuned. Everything's burning at the same time. I would wager that this is drought related, but it's also a function of the flammability of that vegetation type. And you can just see that heat energy. There's not a lot of fuel there on the ground.
So the car. That truck.
They're doing that.
And now it's just picking up the ash and the dirt and sending it aloft.
To try to move it back.
But all those embers that get cast out in front of that thing, they hit the grass and it just sets the grass on fire, and then it further exacerbates the problem. Okay. I would point out that when you see the personnel, which we've kind of cut a lot of this firefighting out, this is pretty routine for them. I mean, they're not like running around worried. They're taking care of business. Calculated risks, you know, they're feeling confident about their ability to put some containment on that fire. They know where the fire's really ripping off, and you can see that's dozer ground, and that fire can be contained with a bulldozer and with aircraft. So, and let's move to the last one, and then we'll open it up for questions. Last image of some fire whirl. So this really is a function of all of the fuels igniting simultaneously and leveraging energy from next to it. Like all of that ground is setting off at the same time, and it's really accelerating that fire behavior. And I would suggest to everybody that, you know, we may not see fire behavior like this in our area, but pretty darn close to it. And I can tell you that by reducing the amount of BTU content, the amount of fuels on the landscape, we can change how extreme that fire is when it does burn off. It's proven, okay? Any questions from the crowd here? Go ahead.
I lived in Paradise. My major concern is escape routes. True escape routes out of the county. And it seems to me that they are very limited. And at times it seems that nobody is truly monitoring the trees that are overhanging roads and could fall and become a problem. So my question is, how are you getting out information, and how are people planning to escape?
Well, I happen to not be from Paradise, and I can't really compare what was there versus here, but I know that Paradise was restricted for ingress and egress.
There are 4 routes out.
Yeah, and not anything like what we have here. We have a major interstate that runs through the middle, and then secondary roads that parallel and then cross. And so very, very different in terms of the access and that sort of thing. My experience is like when we have circumstances that require it, for example, major snow events that cause impacts to the roadways. We've been fortunate enough to be able to provide revenue to the counties to fund the mitigation of that impact. The challenge that we have is that we are amongst private property. The roads run through private property, and it's not really the role of the county to manage a private landowner's land. If there's an impact directly to a roadway, the county has the authority and the funding to do that. But most of the circumstances that I see are a landowner's just lack of care for their land. And we address that by providing funding through our CFIP program. We fund education through cooperators to try and get the public an awareness. We do identify areas that would be an extraordinary risk, and try and promote grant funding to deal with those things. Particularly the post-Snowmageddon scenarios where, you know, you have a huge influx of material close to county roads and you know that that's your ingress and egress. Like those are the things that we've done. But at the end of the day, if the private property owner is not interested or willing or can't afford to treat next to the county road or deep inside their property, there's not really a mechanism. Like we do have hazardous vegetation abatement ordinance that could be leveraged, and that is done. But at the end of the day, there's a challenge there. But my honest assessment is we have sufficient means to evacuate a good portion of the population, and we've done it on numerous wildfires over and over and over again. But if we do have problems, we're going to identify them. We do an annual fire plan process where the local battalion chiefs evaluate the conditions, and if they see something that's a particular concern, then that gets published as kind of one of our priorities, and we try to address those things.
And just to add a little bit more to that, in conjunction with the unit fire plan, we're working on the community wildfire protection plan right now. And coming out soon is going to be our survey. So we have a survey where you'll be able to identify where you are, plot problem areas that you can actually post on a map, so that we can look at those and put it in the same assessment with the rest of our project areas. And then those will be identified as potential areas that we can fund if funding becomes available, if community projects arise and the community wants to come together and do something. If it's in a county jurisdiction, then we can deal with it. But what we'll need is that information, right? The county's really big, you know your street. So participation in those surveys in our CWPP planning meetings and public meetings and outreach events are really important. So, and we have information on the CWPP and how you can sign up to follow our Engage Placer page and the Fire Safe Alliance and the newsletter where more of that information will come out. So lots of ways to get involved. Going to your Fire Safe Council meetings is going to be a really great way to do that as well.
I should probably make sure that everybody understands. Like I take a lot of things for granted that, you know, folks know what's happening out there, but we are blessed with the interstate as an ingress and egress route. And there's an enormous amount of traffic that can go in and out of there. But we've identified that there are challenges there if Caltrans doesn't do an appropriate job of maintaining. And so we've spent, I think we're on year 5 of coordinating with Caltrans to prioritize fuels reduction at certain locations. You know, we know that there are locations where you have a frontage road and next to the freeway and versus where areas where you don't. And so we know, okay, the likelihood of fire could happen here is less than over here. But, you know, if you're going to spend money on doing treatment, do it over here. Or you have a huge number of dead trees. And Caltrans has spent millions of dollars dealing with that tree mortality epidemic. So, you know, from my perspective, like thinking about the public's safety, I'm trying to engage with the agencies to keep those sorts of initiatives moving. The large landscape fuel breaks that are going to halt the fire and like make it so we don't even have to evacuate the town, right? That's the stuff that I'm working on. It's just the challenge is that the individual landowner is a little bit harder to reach, and they are there's lands are constantly selling, you got people moving in, moving out, and you're trying to catch up with them. And we're working on some things. Like there's been ideas about having documentation that's required to be signed at the time you close real estate deals that inform people these are the things that you should be doing as a landowner in the foothills, right? you can't just like make that happen. It takes a lot of coordination and time and motivation. And so anyway, good question. And we're thinking about it, believe me.